everyone, and welcome back. I have started to gradually collect a few more antique pieces here and there, mostly shoes, but occasionally I do come across a beautiful garment that I just absolutely need to know more about. I need to be able to get it in my hands and learn about it and discover all of its secrets. This particular evening bodice that I came across last year is from around the turn into the 20th century, and I just fell in love with it. And it just so happened at the time that I was looking at it, Burnley and Trowbridge had the perfect mint green silk taffeta available that looked like it was going to match it exactly, and I could get the black silk gauze from Dharma Trading and get it pleated up by Tom & Sons, and I just had all these wonderful ideas how I could reproduce this garment, but why? I have nowhere to wear it. But regardless of that, I went ahead, I got all the supplies, I got the bodice, and put it aside figuring that at some point something would come up that was the perfect opportunity to reproduce this bodice and actually get to see it worn and moving and really do the research on it, because it seemed like it had a lot more to it than met the eye. Something was a little bit off, but I couldn't quite place it yet. Thankfully, such an event just happened to come up, so I started working on the shoes and the petticoats and the gown itself back in August, and have been doing so for about 2 months at this point. This is a big project. So before I get into the actual reproduction, I want to take you through the bodice itself, because researching the bodice was very important to me. Understanding what year or possibly even what season it was from would help me understand what sort of skirt shapes, exactly what sort of shoes it needed, everything. I needed to know a very precise date on this bodice, and that is not always terribly easy. Thankfully, for that particular era, it's a little bit easier than other eras. They go through a lot of changes really fast. So what I started off with is looking at some of the more unique features of this bodice. When I looked at mint green or other soft greens for undercolors, when I looked for black silk chiffon or silk gauze for over, there were just so many examples of this, and they started thoroughly by 1897 and continued well close to probably 1910. So that didn't tell me very much. But I immediately went to the sleeves, because those do tell a lot. They are fairly full at the top, but they are fitted down most of the arm, meaning that we have transitioned past 1896. The sleeves have thoroughly deflated, but they haven't completely gone down to the 1900 and beyond point. They still have a little bit of fullness, but from what I could see, that fullness seemed to be more aimed up than out. They were structured and lined in tarlatan, so they really puffed straight up. And to add to this, there were little ruffles along the shoulders, and they too seemed to add to the height. They did not add to the width. And this really quickly brought me down to a much more narrow range of dates. Because if you look at 1897, though the sleeves are somewhat similar in overall size, they tend to aim outwards more. There's a lot more horizontal fullness versus vertical. And by the time we reach the very end of 1897 and more into 1898, really picking up in that spring of 1898, the vertical sleeve height is much more the silhouette that you're seeing. So this tells me that very likely this bodice was probably not earlier than the beginning of 1898. It just doesn't quite fit in with 1897, though there are plenty of examples of things that are gathered and puffed and ruffled and all of that. The overall silhouette of the sleeve really fit well in 1898 and into 1899. What I did find, though, is that by the time we reach sort of mid-1899, the fashion starts to shift pretty rapidly towards that 1900s style. I also found plenty of examples that had similar square necklines or high necklines, because this seemed to have a bit of both. The neckline was where some things were a little bit off, and I actually had to spend a lot of time looking at this piece before I really understood what was going on. But you see the evidence visually from the exterior of both that square neckline with some swags and ruffles, of the higher neckline with the big collar. It all, again, fits really well into that 98, early 99 style. Interestingly enough, like I said, there's some stuff going on with this collar, because the moment you open up the bodice, you find the collar itself is not actually integrated into the bodice. It is an additional piece. So theoretically, this bodice could function completely without it. And I think it did, because if you look at the staining around the bodice, there's staining of the lining that stops pretty abruptly. The neck collar area doesn't have the same staining. So I really do think that the person that had this wore it without that collar, and then the collar went back in at some point. Now I say went back in versus added later, because originally I thought maybe it was a later addition, but it is out of the same lining, it is out of the same fabric, it has all of the same supplies to it. So they either had extra supplies around or this thing was made at the same time. And I came across advertisements for bodices that could be the same style sold with a high neck or a low neck. And what this says to me is very likely this was manufactured to be one of those styles, to be either high or low neck, and the person who purchased it was smart enough to go, if I buy the one with the high neck, I can just unstitch that just is basted in, essentially. I can pop that out and I can get 2 out of 1. And it's a really genius situation. And the fact that the neck area, the collar is really well made, but the stitching to put it back in is really bad. It's really poorly assembled. It's not very evenly done. Really supports the idea that these things were made together, they were made to go together, and somebody who is a little less skilled put them back together. And also, I think put that beaded trim on, because that beaded trim doesn't go with the little sort of buckle that's on the collar. The buckle on the collar is this beautiful turquoise piece, and it just doesn't match. It doesn't coordinate. That's what made the whole thing feel off. The black trim I thought was there to cover up that additional edge, but I found plenty of examples from 98.99 that show that edge being visible, so it doesn't have to be covered up. So this is just somebody had some trim and they wanted to make it a little fancier. They wanted to perhaps make it more appropriate for certain types of evening events, or just change up the style of this bodice. So this thing has gone through a lot of wear, but this gave me so much information. But there's one more factor that, this is one of the best things. Inside, on the waistband, we have the makers. And those makers have a bunch of information available. I found all sorts of advertisements by them. So it's Kirby and Nicholson, and they operate out of Manchester and York as of that point in time. What I could find about the company is they started up in the early 1870s as silk merchants. So they were selling fabrics, and they continued to do so well through the 1870s. Once we reach the 1880s, they start advertising that now they are actually manufacturing clothing. You can come and purchase women's clothing, children's clothing, and household linen goods. They are saying that they are bringing over fashions from France, that they are hiring in seamstresses, so they are doing the construction in-house, they are doing alterations in-house, that if you don't like the French styles as much, they are able to alter it to the more English styles for you. And I don't think this particular bodice is an example of a French style altered to be an English style, because like I said, it was all made to go together and clearly worn both ways. So what this says to me is that this particular company was doing a little bit more mass production than entirely couture to order. If they were the most expensive and the finest couturier, they wouldn't be advertising in the Manchester Guardian. So what I'm thinking this is something that is definitely on the higher end. This is a very well-made garment. It definitely is very fashionable. It's not a practical piece, but it's also something that isn't going to be a house that is creating new designs and leading fashion. They are going to be following the fashions that are coming out of France. They're going to be following the fashions that are being worn by the very, very wealthy. So that means that they probably didn't make this bodice right at the beginning of 1898 when these sorts of things were coming in just barely. There seems to be a mention of a massive shift in styles on a more common scale around the end of summer, beginning of fall in 1898. So this bodice could be from then. It could be anywhere through the winter or into the spring of 99. But that gives me a really good window, which allows me to then go and look what sort of styles of skirts are commonly done. They've sort of moved into a little bit more of a slim skirt with a bit of a flare down at the bottom. There's lots of examples with ruffles and all sorts of pleating and fullness down at the bottom, and went through all of these different skirt examples to end up with one that was actually called a batwing skirt. It is October after all. It just only feels right to sort of lean into that a little bit. So that was the design that I chose for the construction of the skirt to go with it. And then the bodice itself, I reproduced it without the collar piece. I do want to eventually reproduce it with the collar. I have all the supplies for that, but I thought it would be interesting to treat it sort of like the original owner did, where I can wear this a few times without the collar piece in, see how that goes, and then eventually, when I want to change it up a bit, I can add that collar in. I am incredibly excited not only to dive into this and find all of the little secrets that are there, but I get to actually see what it looks like on a person, moving around and functioning, because it's definitely gotten a little sad in its old age and it doesn't quite have the fluff and the vigor that it used to. So let's get into discovering all of these secrets inside of this bodice and eventually get to the point where we get to see how it actually looked at the beginning of its life. The first step was to get a pattern off of the antique, which in a garment like this is rather complex. It has darts that have been cut out, it has all sorts of fiddly gathered up bits, so I tried to get the best pattern I could off of the basic portions. I wasn't worried about patterning out all of the pleated fabrics, all of the gauze, all of those things. I tried to mark out as many details as I can. Like I said, there are darts that are taken out of this. There are lots of little tucks and adjustments in different places, so I do mark where those adjustments are. When it comes to the big darts though, I tend to reference things like the grain of the fabric in order to figure out how much of an angle everything needs to be adjusted to. Once I had everything patterned out, I made some very minor adjustments to get to my measurements and made a mock-up. I was fortunately very close to the original. Most of the adjustments were in the shoulder area. I just needed a lot more height in the shoulders. Overall though, very close fit. It was a little loose at the low back and a little snug at the front. So I ended up making some tiny adjustments to the overall pattern and then starting to cut out. I did the lining out of a plain polished cotton because I couldn't find something quite like the original. I also needed to cut the tarlatan for lining the sleeves out. They don't have any other lining. They are just interlined with a very lightweight, somewhat soft tarlatan. I then used those lining pieces and the tarlatan as my pattern for cutting out of the silk. This meant that everything would match up nicely and I didn't have to worry about putting any marking onto the silk. It might be visible on the exterior later if I had to do alterations. Not all parts of this garment are done where the lining and the exterior silk are the same pattern. The back, for example, the lining has a center back seam, whereas the silk does not. So the very first step that I have to do is put in that center back seam, and then I can lay the back silk piece over and baste everything down so it stays nice and flat together. When it comes to the fronts, there are two different types of fronts. All of them, however, have this little, what we call a fish start off on the side, meaning that it's pointed at both ends rather than large at one end and coming to a point at the other. It helps get over the curves of the hips and the waist. This is something that you might find when you put on bodices of the late 19th or early 20th centuries, that you find that there's wrinkles at that area, and this is the dart that helps take care of that. The dart is only done on the lining. Same thing goes with any other little darts that are done. Sometimes there's a horizontal one sort of just above the bust line at the center front. Sometimes there's ones into the armscye. They put them wherever they need them in order to really fit and smooth that lining over the body. When it comes to the underfront, the front that you won't actually see, because there's a big front that overlaps the whole thing, this has a piece of silk that is laid down over it, and it's a very similar shape. The big darts in the front are done all together. The only thing that is done ahead of time is this little fish dart on the side, and so I just had to fidget around the cotton and the silk to make sure that they laid flat and smooth together, since the cotton has a little more curve than the silk does now. Once I had all of those pieces put together, I actually made a second front piece that is not going to be used, but it would help me fit the garment better than trying to figure out where the front actually overlaps. Everything seems to fit pretty well. I did have to let out and recurve the center front slightly, but that was pretty easy to adjust. I then got started on finishing off the center front that's going underneath. Most of the edges for this are turned back. Sometimes, like in this case, they have a little bit of boning put into them. This center front does, just up to about the bust level, so it doesn't go the whole way up. The darts are also cut back and bound. All of the edges on this are either bound or covered in some sort of ribbon. It's just a basic running stitch to finish off all of the seam allowances, to finish off the darts, and it's a really lightweight, almost China silk sort of taffeta ribbon. All of the boning channels in the original are done with a silk twill, which is really hard to find today, pretty much impossible. I ended up finding a silk satin ribbon from Brilliant Trowbridge where the wrong side looks really close to the original and has a good weight and will hold up to the boning and the stress of that, which was the more important factor than just the appearance. With the boning channels, the very top, about 1 inch, is left loose from the seams where it's stitched down, and then the rest is just running stitched to either the lining or to the seam allowances. There is a little bit of extra ribbon kind of bunched up for the spring and curve of the boning, but not a ton in the original. For the 2 exterior fronts, they are actually stitched up with their darts in just the lining. There are no darts in the exterior silk. I don't have to bind and finish those edges because they will actually be turned to the outside and the silk placed over it, hiding that raw seam allowance. They are still trimmed with the same curve, however, meaning that as you get to where the waistline is, there's some little indentations in, so that where there's an easier time to get over the curve of the dart. For the silk exterior fronts, they seem to be draped at a bit of an angle in order to deal with the curve of the front. They have to be able to rely on the bias to work with that, where the grain actually runs from the top of the shoulder to the center front down at the bottom. I found it was easiest to just cut a piece that was plenty large and then drape literally on my body, meaning that I found where the shoulder was and then that center front lower point first, and then I just worked my way around the body. I started with the neckline and the center front because those were important to not have them be too full or too stretched. They couldn't have darts or gathers that I could hide in that area, so I wanted to make sure that was done first. If I ended up with excess anywhere, I could hide that better under the arm. The fabric then just got smoothed and pushed from around the neckline, down the center front, along the bottom, up the side, and into the armpit, because like I said, that is the place that I can have the most forgiveness when it comes to easing fabric in. All in all, it ended up with a fairly close fit for the fact that I had a very curvy lining and there was no shaping whatsoever in that silk. It worked out pretty well. What I did, rather than immediately stitch it to the lining, was to pop everything off, come up with the exact shape of that silk so I could cut it down to where the edges needed to be with the seam allowance on it, and then I was able to take that piece and cut it out again, so that way I didn't have to drape on both sides of my body. Assumably, they're pretty even. I am pretty symmetrical body-wise, so I wasn't concerned about them needing a big difference, and like I said, I didn't want to do that twice. That's a lot of effort as it is. Once I was able to do that, then I started stitching everything together. The center front seam for the exterior portion gets all of the hooks on it. Once those hooks are stitched down, then a ribbon is placed somewhat over them. Just the hook portion is exposed, but this hides all of the stitches and the loops on the bottom. This is a technique that I found all over this bodice. Basically, all of the edges were finished with different types of ribbon or tape, and the areas where the hooks and eyes were no exception. When it came to the eyes, the antique hooks and eyes that I had gotten weren't quite the same shape. This doesn't seem like it's actually that important, but when it comes to these eyes on the original, they are flattened, meaning that they won't extend out quite as far from the center front line. So I went ahead and took needle nose pliers and flattened out those eyes to be the correct shape. From there, the originals are covered in silk thread. They're done with a buttonhole stitch in order to make sure that there is a tight fit between the hook and the eye. Sometimes it's good to add bulk to the eye, so that's what they did, and that's what I'm doing. Just taking a heavier weight silk thread and doing a buttonhole stitch around the entire eye. Yes, this is tedious, but like I said, it creates a very snug and very secure fit at the center front. I then got to move on to the first really true fitting of this entire bodice with the hooks and eyes, with all of the front pieces. I hadn't put the hooks and eyes at the side yet because I wanted to make sure that I had enough overlap there, because it does need to be slightly bigger since it's going over more bulk. I was finding that the neckline gapped a little bit there, but I figured I could make sure that as I taped it and finished it, pulled it a little bit snugly, and it would hold its place well. Everything else about the bodice seemed to fit well. I didn't feel like I needed to make any other alterations. The boning was holding everything down into place where it should be, preventing any wrinkles at the side. Not that it really mattered all that much with this particular bodice, as the whole thing is going to get covered in gauze very shortly. For the gauze, I originally tried working on the table. I pulled out a tailor's ham and some other curvy things that I had in order to get the curve under the bodice that I needed, but I quickly realized in doing this that it was just really fidgety to make sure that I had both the length and the width working out correctly and all the angles and everything, especially since I was trying to do this in a very uneven pattern. The original uses a slightly different type of pleat than the fabric that I had done up, but theirs is very erratic, and I wanted to mimic that a little bit so it wasn't smooth over the entire body, that instead it sort of stood out from the body and had some gaps where you could see the mint green through it. And I eventually realized the easiest way to do this was just to put it on the mannequin, even though it honestly did not fit the mannequin very well. The curves were there and I could work and baste and pin while the bodice was in its correct shape. One of the most interesting features about this bodice that I found was that the little scallops at the front and the back are actually created by the extra fabric that comes out of that neckline. So it gets stitched down along the neckline and then trimmed back from the shoulders and just falls forward. It's a really genius way to not waste any of that fabric and to come up with a design at the same time while not having to deal with raw edges. They were smart enough in this case to use the selvage edge of the pleated fabric for both of those little swags, and I was able to as well. Once all of the gauze was in place and I knew that the edges of the bodice were correctly folded back, I was able to start finishing off with tape and adding in the last little bits of hooks and eyes and start basting back all of those raw edges, which are going to again get covered up with more ribbon. The bottom edge, unlike the other edges, is finished up with a bias strip of the silk taffeta. In some of Abby's examples, they also put a little bit of tarlatan or crinoline down there. I didn't seem to find that that was the case with my bodice, but if I had had issues with wrinkles, it would have been a great place to add that. Then I was able to move on to the sleeves, which those are completely lined in tarlatan. The very first step, as always, is to baste everything together, and then I had to get going on the really unusual gathered and puffed gauze treatment on the sleeves. All they did was start off by putting 3 gathering lines on a very large piece of fabric. I measured out about how long it needed to be by actually measuring the ruffles on the original, so it should be pretty close to the amount of fullness that they had, and I left a full width on the fabric to make sure that I had enough for the overall width of the sleeves. It's actually a fair amount of fabric gathered up. I think it came out to about 50 inches or so. And once I gathered up these 3 sections, the center one gets first pinned down to the line of where the entire thing gets stitched to. The other 2 lines of gathering then get tucked under. So it's one width of fabric that sort of creates 2 little puffs by way of these 3 lines of gathering. It was so simple once I figured out how it worked. It's a really genius and fast way to add a lot of interest on those sleeves, and it definitely feeds into the very erratic looking nature of the way that they do the gathers on both the bodice and the sleeves. Obviously the sleeves are done out of a plain gauze. This stuff is not pleated, it's just gathered up. Those ruffles are then stitched with 1 thread running down the middle that catches through all of the different layers as it goes. I ended up having to put a little bit of an angle into my stitch in order to make sure that I caught all 3 gathering stitches and everything stayed nice and stable. On the original, they definitely missed a few spots, so they weren't putting quite as much effort into it as I was. When it comes to the rest of the sleeve, like I said, it's very erratic. It's sort of pleated up. Some are really large, some are really small. One of the seams does actually have the gauze go into the seam, while the other has the gauze carry on over. One seam where the gauze does go ahead and pleat into it, I went ahead, pinned that, basted it down, made sure it was nice and secure, and then I went and got that smaller underpiece for the sleeve and stitched the silks together. That's the seam where the gauze does not come in. And I wanted to do everything flat on the bigger piece first. I figured that was easier than trying to manage something that already had some shape to it. And then once it was shaped, I was able to pull the gauze up and over, make sure it had enough length along each one of those little tucks and pleats to get over the arm and back around to the seam where it needs to be attached. Inside of the sleeves, they don't bind the edges unlike the bodice, they just whipped over them. And in the original, the gauze was either cut really, really close to the seam allowance or it pulled out with time. I don't know, a lot of it has escaped the seam allowance at this point, so I left extra in the working process at this point to make sure that it was good before I trimmed it back a little bit further and whipped it down at the end. The sleeve itself is then just gathered up along the top edge at the sleeve head and machine stitched into the arm. There is some ribbon binding that is hand stitched over the interior to hide the raw edges as well. The final decorations that I had to deal with on the exterior were the ruffles at the shoulders and at the wrists. These were all actually hemmed by machine. They used a chain stitching machine, which I found really interesting. I don't have a chain stitching machine. I'm not going to deal with that. I just did it regularly on the machine. This is not only a little fidgety to do because it is a silk gauze, but I am going to have to go back in and iron those pleats back in because they didn't leave them loose and wavy at the ends. They had the pleats working the whole way through. So after I got all of my things hemmed, ironed the pleats back in, then for the shoulders, there are 2 sets of pleats that are stitched to a 1-inch wide silk satin ribbon. That silk satin ribbon is then gathered up and eased a little bit and just running stitched down to the very edge of the shoulder seam. So for the most part, it's stitched directly onto the bodice, but on the one side where the bodice overlaps, it has to be stitched just barely to the sleeve. I then had to put a few tiny little tacks about every inch or so along the ruffles. Some of them do go down into the sleeve. This means that the ruffle won't flip back up and over onto my neck since it is a tall sleeve, and make sure that everything stays flat and ruffled. It definitely gives a lot of height up there, but again, if I move too much, it just flips over. So I needed those tiny little tacks along the way to make sure that everything stayed where it was supposed to. The end of the sleeves was finished off very roughly. The only reason that it seems to hold itself back at all is because the little ruffle that's stitched to a 1/2-inch wide ribbon is then sort of running stitched to the sleeve itself. It doesn't go through enough layers to hold the fold back, and I could literally just unfold that section of the sleeve. They didn't whip over the edges, they didn't bind over the edges. Clearly that was left unfinished. I was actually working on the skirt at the same time that I was working on the bodice, going back and forth depending on what supplies came in and what steps I needed to film at what times. The skirt itself, I shaped out a little bit differently than the pattern I originally had, which I had used for a different gown previously. The entire process of finishing the skirt was something that I was sort of making up as I go, simply because I didn't have an original to base it off of in the same way. There certainly were techniques that I was using. I actually had a small section of a book that described how to make a skirt of this era, and between looking at that and the originals in Abby's collection, came up with what I thought was a pretty good shape. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of the structure and inner linings and details of the skirt here because there's just not enough time. I am going to do an entire Patreon video on it, however, so if you want to see more about that, head on over to my Patreon and check it out. But the skirt itself was meant very much to pair with the bodice, to flatter it, to not detract from it. here's the thing. We're missing something. 1 second. Oh my god, it looks like a fucking Vogue shoot, Rose.